In a garden in England, a sundial carries 4 lines of poetry. Carved by hand, never explained. The woman who put them there had just come home from a voyage that had nearly broken her marriage, and had chosen, quietly, not to break it. Her name was Clementine Churchill. Her husband was the man who held civilization together while it was burning. He couldn't have done it without her. History almost forgot she existed. This is her story. There is a garden in Kent, England, where a sundial still stands. It is old now, the stone worn soft by a century of English rain. But if you look closely at its base, you can still read 4 lines, carved by hand, long ago. It does not do to wander, too far from sober men. But there's an island yonder. I think of it again. No one ever explained those lines. The woman who carved them never spoke of them publicly. She left them there, in the garden of a house called Chartwell, and let the moss grow over them slowly for the rest of her life. Her name was Clementine Churchill. You know her husband. Everyone does. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister who told Britain to stand firm when the rest of the world expected it to fall. The man whose voice, carried by radio across a nation in darkness, became the sound of resistance itself. The man whose name appears in history books, on monuments, and the title of more documentaries than almost any other figure of the 20th century. You know him. You do not know her. And yet, according to the biographers who spent years inside the Churchill archives, without Clementine, there may have been no Winston Churchill to know at all. Not the Churchill of 1940. Not the Churchill who held civilization together through 5 years of war. She was the one who kept him from breaking. Tonight, we tell her story. Not the story of a devoted wife standing quietly in the background. Not a footnote. The full story of a woman who gave everything she had to a cause that history would credit entirely to someone else. It begins, as all the most enduring stories do, with a wound she was born into, long before she ever heard the name Churchill. On the 1st of April, 1885, a girl was born in London to a family in quiet collapse. Her name, registered in the records of the era, was Clementine Ogilvy Hosier. Her mother, Lady Blanche, was the daughter of an earl, beautiful, restless, and trapped in a marriage that had been failing for years. Her legal father, Sir Henry Hosier, was a decorated soldier and secretary of Lloyd's of London. By most outward appearances, the Hosier family was exactly what aristocratic Britain expected it to be. Outward appearances, in this case, were almost everything. Lady Blanche's marriage to Sir Henry was, by the standards of those who observed it closely, a marriage in name only. Strained, distant, and, on both sides, quietly dishonest. Sir Henry, it was widely believed, was sterile. Lady Blanche was known to have had affairs. After he found her with a lover in 1891, the couple formally separated. The children, Clementine among them, remained with their mother. Biographer Joan Hardwicke, in her study of the Churchill family, surmised that all of Lady Blanche's children were likely fathered not by Sir Henry, but by another man entirely. Bertram Freeman Mitford, the first Baron Redesdale, who was married to Lady Blanche's own sister. If that surmise is correct, and most scholars consider it the most probable explanation, then Clementine grew up not knowing with certainty who her father was. She was 6 years old when her parents separated. She was 14 when her mother moved the family to Dieppe, on the northern coast of France, where they lived inexpensively in a house above the harbor, eating simply, wearing clothes that no longer quite fit the family's faded claims to status. Her older sister Kitty died when Clementine was 15, quietly, without drama, of causes that the family did not speak about at length. Her mother moved them again and again. What Clementine gained from this childhood, unstable, sometimes humiliating, always uncertain, was not bitterness. That is what surprises the people who study her. What she gained was something harder to name, a kind of clarity, a refusal to be deceived by surfaces, an understanding, from very young, that the respectable exterior of a life could conceal almost anything. She was, by every account of those who knew her, a striking young woman, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with what her future husband would describe as an almost electric quality of attention. She read widely. She thought precisely. She had opinions she was not afraid to voice. By the time she entered London society, she had received, by her sister's joking count, enough marriage proposals to fill a filing system. She turned them all down. Not out of pride exactly. Out of the knowledge that she was waiting for something she had not yet found. In the summer of 1908, she was seated at a dinner party next to a man she had met briefly 4 years earlier at a ball. He had made no particular impression on her then, but on this evening, something was different. His name was Winston Spencer Churchill. He was 33 years old, a member of Parliament, already a figure of some public notoriety, part statesman, part adventurer, part writer of books about his own exploits. He was not conventionally handsome. He was, by most accounts of the evening, talking almost constantly. And yet, what passed between them at that dinner table, what specific words, what exchange of ideas, what moment of recognition, is not recorded in any document that has survived. What we know is the result. Within a month, Winston Churchill had proposed to Clementine Hosier, and she had said yes. They married on the 12th of September, 1908, in the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster. She was 23 years old. He was 10 years her senior. The wedding photographs show a young woman who looks, in equal measure, composed and alive. Winston, for his part, wrote to a friend shortly after, "My most brilliant achievement was my ability to persuade my wife to marry me." He was not entirely joking. What followed was a marriage that would last 57 years, through 2 world wars, through financial ruin and political glory, through the deaths of children and the collapse of empires. A marriage that would be, by any measure, extraordinary. And a marriage that would cost Clementine Churchill, in quiet installments spread across a lifetime, nearly everything she had. She had said once, according to her biographer Sonia Purnell, that she would have loved to have been a statesman in her own right. If only, as she put it, she had been born with trousers rather than petticoats. Instead, she would pour every instinct she had into the career of a man who had been born with both the trousers and the century. The question that haunts the story, the question that runs beneath everything that follows, is this: did she ever regret it? The sundial at Chartwell suggests the answer was not simple. Between 1909 and 1922, Clementine Churchill gave birth to 5 children. The first, Diana, arrived in July of 1909. Then Randolph in 1911. Then Sarah in 1914. Then, in November of 1918, 4 days after the end of the First World War, as Europe was still learning to breathe again, a 4th child, a girl. Winston named her Marigold. He called her the Duckadilly. She had copper-colored hair and a laugh that by all family accounts carried across the garden at Chartwell. She was, by every description that survives her, the kind of child who makes a house feel more inhabited, more alive. Clementine and Winston were, by the early 1920s, a couple whose lives had been shaped more by absence than by presence. Winston's career demanded constant travel, constant crisis, constant consumption of his wife's attention. The children, even by the standards of upper-class British families of the time, where distance between parents and children was considered normal, saw, according to Sonia Purnell's biography, very little of either parent. In the summer of 1921, the family rented a cottage at Broadstairs on the southeastern coast of England. Marigold was 2 years old and 9 months. She had been ill twice over the winter, a cough, a recurring fever, but she seemed recovered. Winston had business in Scotland. Clementine was visiting friends. The children were left in the care of a French governess. The governess noticed, some days later, that Marigold's cough had returned. She hesitated to alarm the parents. She sent a telegram, not immediately, but after some days had passed. By the time Clementine reached Broadstairs, her daughter was gravely ill. Winston arrived on the next train from London. On the 23rd of August, 1921, Marigold Churchill died of septicemia. She was 2 years old and 9 months. According to biographer William Manchester, Clementine, in the moment she understood what had happened, cried out in a way that those present would not forget, a sound that Manchester described as that of a person in mortal pain. Winston stood beside her, unable to speak. They buried Marigold in Kensal Green Cemetery the following Saturday. Press photographers appeared at the gate. Winston walked to them and said something quiet. They left. He wrote to Clementine some weeks later from Scotland. Many tender thoughts, my darling one, of you and your sweet kittens. Alas, I keep on feeling the hurt of the Duckadilly. Clementine, according to her daughter Mary Soames, never spoke of Marigold again. Not in any conversation that any of her surviving children ever overheard. Not once in the 56 years she lived after that August morning. Mary Soames, asked about it late in her own life, was quiet for a moment before she spoke. My mother never talked about it, she said. I think it was a terrible, terrible grief in her life. The grief went underground. It had nowhere else to go. The following year, in 1922, Clementine gave birth to a 5th child, Mary, who would become, in time, the only one of the Churchill children to live a life untouched by severe crisis. Mary would be the one who wrote her mother's biography with a prize-winning care. Mary would be the one who, decades later, would sit in a garden in Kent and try to explain a woman the world had never quite seen. But in the years between Marigold's death and the world's second catastrophe, there was still more that Clementine had to survive. And some of it arrived not from outside, but from inside a marriage that was beginning by the early 1930s to show the cost of everything it had demanded. By 1934, the Churchill marriage was under strain. Winston was in what history would later call his wilderness years, out of office, politically marginalized, spending his time at Chartwell writing, painting, and building stone walls with his hands, while warning anyone who would listen about the danger rising in Germany. Nobody important was listening. The finances were precarious. Chartwell, the beloved house in Kent, was expensive to maintain. Winston's spending, on brandy, on travel, on ambitions that had no immediate return, was consistently beyond what the household could absorb. Clementine, who managed the accounts with the precision of someone who had known real poverty in childhood, was exhausted. She had been exhausted, in different ways, for a long time. In December of 1934, she accepted an invitation that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A friend, Walter Guinness, the first Lord Moyne, was sailing his yacht, the Rosaura, to the Dutch East Indies. The journey would take months. The purpose was partly a naturalist's expedition. Lord Moyne intended to bring back a living Komodo dragon for the London Zoo. Clementine was invited as a guest. Winston, who disliked cruises, encouraged her to go. He knew she needed to rest. The party on board the Rosaura for the first leg of the journey included a man named Terence Phillip, an art dealer, 42 years old, 7 years younger than Clementine, with a charm and an ease that the months at sea would do nothing to diminish. According to her daughter Mary Soames, who later wrote the authoritative biography of her mother, Clementine, during that voyage, fell romantically in love with Terence Phillip. Mary Soames did not attempt to describe exactly what that meant in terms of action. She described it in terms of feeling, and then, with the precision of a daughter who had thought about this for many years, she noted that the marriage had survived the voyage. Clementine was thousands of miles away when word reached the yacht that Chartwell had nearly caught fire, that servants were threatening to resign, that creditors had arrived, that the daily life Winston could not manage without her had begun, almost immediately, to unravel. The letters he sent her during this period show a man who was only beginning to understand how much of his foundation had always been her. She came home. In the garden at Chartwell, she placed a sundial on a small stone base. Beneath the sundial, she buried something she had brought back from the voyage. A bally dove, a small bird she had carried across 2 oceans. When the dove eventually died, she had it interred there. On the base of the sundial, she had 4 lines carved. She never explained them to anyone. Here lies the bally dove. It does not do to wander, too far from sober men. But there's an island yonder. I think of it again. On the first day of January, 1935, while still at sea on the final stretch of the voyage, Clementine wrote to Winston. The letter, preserved among the Churchill correspondence edited by their daughter Mary, reads in part, "Oh, my darling, I'm thinking so much of you and how you have enriched my life." She came home. She stayed. The sundial remained in the garden. And the island, whatever it had represented to her, remained only in those 4 carved lines which no one asked about, and which she never explained. In May of 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. France was falling. The British Expeditionary Force was being driven toward the coast at Dunkirk. German bombers had begun to appear over British soil. The country that had spent 2 years hoping the catastrophe might somehow stay on the continent now understood, with a cold and settling clarity, that there was no buffer left. Britain stood alone. Churchill, at 65, had waited his entire adult life for this moment. He had been warning about Hitler's Germany since the mid-1930s, while the political establishment dismissed him as an alarmist, a relic, a man of a previous century. Now, the previous century had come back, in the worst possible form. And he was the only figure in British public life who had been right about it from the beginning. The weight of what had to be done was enormous. And yet, in those first weeks, as Churchill took command of a war machine that was barely functioning and a government that was still not entirely sure it had chosen the right man, something was going wrong in the room. Something that had nothing to do with strategy. He was, according to those who worked with him in that period, becoming difficult, brusque, impatient in ways that made the people around him hesitant to bring him the information he needed. He was snapping at ministers. He was dismissing concerns before they were fully expressed. He was, in the words Sonia Purnell used when she described this moment to NPR, in danger of losing the support of the very people he needed most. Clementine saw it. She had, over 32 years of marriage, developed a precise understanding of the difference between Winston's productive darkness, the focused intensity that generated his best work, and the kind of behavior that drove away the people he depended on. She knew when to let him be. She also knew when to speak. In June of 1940, she wrote him a letter. It is, according to the Churchill Archives Center at Cambridge, the only letter she is known to have written to him in the entire year of 1940. A year in which, if ever a wife might have been excused for writing frequently and urgently, it was this one. She did not write about the war. She did not write about the bombs or the evacuations or the extraordinary weight of what they were both carrying. She wrote about how he was treating people. The letter opened, "I hope you will forgive me if I tell you something I feel you ought to know." She then described, with the directness that had always characterized her relationship with him, what she had observed. The rudeness, the effect it was having. The risk of isolating himself precisely when he needed people to trust him with the truth. She signed it, as she always did in her most important letters, with the word devotedly. According to Sonia Purnell's biography, Winston read the letter, and his behavior changed. The people around him noticed. They began, over the weeks that followed, to revise their estimate of how this was going to go. What Clementine was doing, in those same weeks, was the kind of work that leaves no monument. She was visiting the bombed areas of London. She was writing to government ministers, insisting that the public air raid shelters have heating, that there be proper fire exits, that the women and children sleeping underground during the Blitz have mattresses. According to Purnell, she effectively pushed for the production and distribution of 2 million additional beds for civilians sheltering from the raids. She understood, in a way that Winston could see only partially from the seat of power, that Britain's capacity to endure was built not from speeches alone, but from the daily conditions in which ordinary people were being asked to survive. She kept no public record of this. She sought no credit. She had her own code about what a woman in her position was permitted to claim. But the letter, sitting in the archives at Cambridge, is one of the most quietly powerful documents to survive that year. France had fallen. London would soon be burning. The fate of the century was being decided in a sequence of rooms and skies and convoys. And in the middle of it all, a woman sat down and wrote her husband a single page, not about the war, but about how he was treating the people who were trying to help him fight it. He listened. History does not record that she wrote again. On the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended. In London, the news broke like a physical thing. Into the streets, into the pubs, into the crowds that formed almost instantly on every major thoroughfare in the city. 1 million people or more gathered in Whitehall. Winston Churchill appeared at a window and spoke, and the crowd below him roared with a sound that had been building for 5 years. He had won. Britain had won. The world, or that part of it that faced west, had been preserved. Clementine Churchill was not there. She was in Moscow. She had arrived in the Soviet Union on the 2nd of April, 1945, as chairwoman of the British Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, an initiative she had led for most of the war, raising money and organizing medical supplies for a Soviet population that had absorbed a level of suffering almost beyond calculation. The Soviets had invited her to see firsthand how the fund's contributions had been used. She had extended her stay once, then again. She was still there, a guest of the Soviet government, when the German surrender was formally announced. She heard Winston's voice on a radio feed. The signal was poor. She was 5,000 miles from the crowds in Whitehall, from the balcony at Buckingham Palace, from the moment that everyone in Britain would remember for the rest of their lives. She was the reason he was standing there, and she was not. The years that followed were, in their own quiet way, as hard as anything that had come before. Perhaps harder, because the hardness wore no name that history recognized. Winston, after the euphoria of victory, lost the general election of 1945 in a landslide that shocked him deeply. He returned to power in 1951 at 76 years old and served again as Prime Minister until 1955. In June of 1953, he suffered a severe stroke. Serious enough, according to Lord Moran, his physician, that the true nature of his condition was kept from the public and from most of the cabinet. Clementine managed the information. She monitored his recovery. She made decisions, in consultation with his doctors and his small circle of trusted advisors, about what could be revealed and when. She had always managed the gap between what Winston was and what the world needed to believe he was. The stroke simply made that gap wider. And then there were the children. In October of 1963, Clementine received news that her eldest daughter, Diana, had died. Diana was 54 years old. She had struggled for years with severe depression, had been hospitalized more than once, had lived a life that those close to her described as one of recurring crisis. Her death was the result of an overdose of barbiturates. It is widely regarded, by the historians and biographers who have written about the Churchill family, as a suicide. Clementine was 78 years old. Winston was 88, already diminished by the strokes that had accumulated across the previous decade, increasingly unable to communicate or respond in the ways he once had. He sat in the house at Chartwell, or in London, and looked out of windows. The man who had once consumed every room he entered had grown quiet. Sarah, the third child, was struggling with alcoholism that had deepened over the years. Randolph, the only son, was talented and troubled in equal measure. His life lived in the long shadow of a father whose recognition he had spent decades trying to earn. Only Mary, the youngest, the one who had been spared the worst of it, was whole. One biographer, reviewing the arc of the Churchill children's lives, noted that the four who survived beyond infancy had, with the exception of Mary, experienced outcomes that suggested the cost of having parents who had given so much of themselves to something larger than the family. The children saw little of either parent, even by the standards of a class and era that considered parental distance unremarkable. Clementine knew this. She had always known it. In the way that people who are honest with themselves know the things they cannot afford to look at directly. She had made a choice. Or rather, a series of choices that accumulated over decades into something that looked, from the outside, like a single act of devotion. She had poured herself into Winston's career, and she had done it fully, and the world had been changed as a result. Whether her children had been changed in ways she had intended, that was a different question. Winston Churchill died on the 24th of January, 1965. He was 90 years old. His state funeral, one of the largest in British history, drew heads of state from across the world. The procession through London was watched by hundreds of thousands in person and by millions on television. Clementine stood at the graveside in St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, in the Oxfordshire village where the Churchills were buried. She was 79 years old. She was, by every photograph of that day, composed. She would live another 12 years. Clementine Churchill died on the 12th of December, 1977. She was 92 years old. She outlived her husband by 12 years. She outlived Diana by 14. She outlived 2 world wars, the British Empire, and the particular idea of womanhood into which she had been born. The idea that a woman's gifts, however considerable, were best expressed through the career of someone else. In her last years, she was quiet. She had always been, at heart, a private person, more comfortable in a small room with people she trusted than on any stage. She had given interviews, accepted honors, attended events. But the inner life, the part that had carved those lines into the sundial at Chartwell, she had kept to herself. Mary Soames, her youngest daughter, wrote the biography that would become the authoritative account of her mother's life. It won the Wolfson Prize for History. In it, Mary described a woman of extraordinary intelligence and precision who had understood, more clearly than perhaps anyone, what it cost to stand beside power for a lifetime. "You know," Winston had said once, according to his own account, to Franklin Roosevelt, "I tell Clemmy everything." He had told her everything, and she had carried it. The strategy, the grief, the self-doubt, the episodes of darkness he called the black dog. All of it had passed through her, been processed, been absorbed, been returned to him in a form he could use. She had been, in the formulation of Sonia Purnell, his most important weapon, his editor, his conscience, his warning system, his ballast. The person who wrote the only letter of 1940 that changed how he led a war. And the world, which remembered everything about Winston Churchill, remembered almost nothing about her. The sundial is still at Chartwell. The house is a National Trust property now, open to visitors, filled with Winston's paintings and his books, and the stone walls he built with his hands in the garden. People come from every part of the world to stand in the rooms where he worked, to see the desk where the great speeches were drafted, to feel something of the proximity of that life. Some of them, walking in the garden, find the sundial. Most do not stop to read the inscription. It does not do to wander, too far from sober men. But there's an island yonder. I think of it again. She never explained those lines. Whatever island she had carried with her from the voyage of 1934 to 1935, whatever feeling she had buried beneath that stone, along with the Bali dove, along with the years and the choices and the grief, she kept it. She had spent a lifetime keeping things. The sundial stays.